up only 7, but you're right. It was never really in question.
Yeah, Northwestern just doesn't have enough horsepower. And
No,
Wisconsin, man, they're an
no.
irritating team. Ugh. I mean, the way they just kind of like flop around and stuff,
Yep.
they are annoying for sure. Okay, folks, I'm just going to get things loaded up here. And we'll should be better at this than I am right now.
Well, I guess the Iowa-Ohio State game was competitive.
That was a good game. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a good game. And, of course, Hawks won, so that made it even better. So
Well,
we get a bonus game today. So it's nice for us.
yeah.
Okay. All right. For those of you joining, welcome. I'll try and keep track of things, but it is a little strange here on the road. Hey, everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, coming to you live from Indy at the Big Ten tournament to talk about MSU's opening round opponent, the Oregon Ducks. Before we begin, some quick recognition to William Kurtz for his very generous gift to the show via PayPal, and to Benny Smalls, who joined all the other Scott Skiles supporters, this time on YouTube, and also the number of Scott Skiles supporters on Patreon. Thanks a ton to you guys for supporting the MSU content we put out. If you'd like to join the multitude of awesome Spartan fans, head on over to our support page at tffinots.com/support to get the necessary links. Okay, Rod, it's the nice thing about the Big Ten being so big is that when you face Big Ten teams in the Big Ten tournament, you haven't played them a lot. It's usually just once. So that's the case, obviously, for Friday for Michigan State. We'll play Oregon for the second time this year. The first day of the tournament saw all upsets. The lower seeds won 15, 14, and 13. That has not been the case, obviously, so far today, as we're between the second and third session, and both the favorites have won so far, beginning with the Ducks. The Oregon has been very good since they played Michigan State. They have won what is it, 8 in a row now, I think.
That's
And
right.
yeah, so they are on a heater. They're 24-8 overall. They won, of course, against Indiana by 13. Lots of sad IU fans here. Tons of them. It was mostly IU, and then as soon as that game was over, the place emptied out quite a bit.
Yeah,
So of course,
let me ask you a question. It
sure.
looked to me like the Oregon fan base was directly behind their bench and that was it. Is
That is
that
pretty much it. I mean,
okay?
it's possible that the green in the stands were also Michigan State fans. There were some. It's a different
I
kind of green, so probably
I
not.
saw some of that on
But
television, so I
yeah, but
think you're
there
right.
weren't many. Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
they didn't travel. SC fans
That's
didn't
the
travel. Not surprising. Like
Yep.
Rutgers fans don't travel. I mean, there's lots of teams that don't
Yeah,
travel.
and
Northwestern, there's no Northwestern fans really for the most part. Even Iowa has had a very small showing yet last night, and of course Ohio State. Aside from that,
well,
the big nut or whatever that guy is.
we
So
were yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and I really do think right now I could be I could be throwing the jinx on these evening session games today, but I'm assuming that Illinois and Purdue are probably going to win. And over SC,
in
well,
Iowa,
over Iowa and SC respectively.
yeah.
But assuming that that happens, it's been a largely lackluster first couple of days, but as you pointed out, and it's absolutely true, for the most part, these are teams that aren't very good.
No,
I
there's
mean, they're good enough as we know, as we've experienced firsthand. They're good enough to occasionally pull off a win here or there against a good opponent, but by and large, this is the bottom end of the conference, right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. They're all losing
and
records.
but I do think, again, if tonight holds, we could really have, at least on paper, a very, very good quarterfinals and then on in from there. And it's because you've added 2 teams in UCLA and Oregon that are pretty good teams to the usual standard Big Ten mix. You've got, I mean, we're looking at, I think, 9 at the most Big Ten teams in the tournament. IU would be the one on the precipice right now.
Right.
But 8 of those, Oregon's your eighth team, basically. They're pretty good, as we're going
Hmm.
to talk about.
Yeah.
So you've got a depth, and I'm saying all this just to say, in years past, in a quarterfinal game, if you were one of those, double bye or bye teams, in years past in this event, especially a team in Michigan State's position where you're the one seed. Your first game, you were probably playing a tomato can of to one extent or another.
Or often a desperate bubble team.
That too, sometimes,
Yeah.
but often just not a team that's of the caliber that you're really particularly worried about it. Now, upsets happen, all that stuff, but by and large, that's how it would cut. That's not the case this
No.
year. I mean, if Purdue and Illinois get through, you are looking at a quarterfinal field tomorrow where they're obviously all NCAA tournament teams solidly. Probably the worst any of them are going to be as a six seed. So we're not talking about, that's another thing. We're not talking about, as we've seen in I guess Illinois would be the exception to that. Illinois might be a little lower than that, but they have the highest ceiling of anybody in the world. So we know that doesn't matter, right?
Exactly.
But you understand what I'm saying? Like,
Hmm.
this is not, we don't have those, as we'll often see a Big Ten team that, was maybe looking at being in Dayton, for
Right.
example. That's been something that's happened more than once. We don't have that. This would be a real, I would argue it would probably be the most competitive quarterfinal field in an objective sense. Doesn't mean the games will live up to that, but just on paper, it would be the most competitive quarterfinal field we've ever seen. And
Yeah,
it stands to
that's
reason
right.
because the league is now, 96 teams big. So no
And
wonder.
getting bigger.
But it's still for fans of competitive higher level college basketball, it's probably a pretty good thing.
Yeah.
Because all these games tomorrow, again, assuming Purdue and Illinois get through, they shake out to be pretty competitive games. I mean, you could have quarterfinals, the one we're going to talk about. You could have, well, you will have Wisconsin and UCLA. That's a done deal. That's a very good game on paper. You could have Illinois and Maryland, and then you could have Purdue and Michigan. Those are games that any random Wednesday night of the week, if you're even not a deep fan, but just kind of a casual Big Ten fan, you'd probably watch some of that.
Sure.
So that's a good thing.
All right, so we are between sessions, and so just as a reminder for those of you listening and watching, this will be a not abbreviated, but it'll be an efficient episode and pithy. So, just briefly go through offense as a reminder. Oregon is 35th overall, which is good, but not fantastic. They don't do anything really great, but they do everything really well. So they're okay shooting team. They're 161st from three, 112th from two, 138th in offensive rebounding, 94th in turnover percentage. They do shoot free throws very well at 76%, but that's which is good for 49th nationally, but they don't get there very often. So they're 156 and actually getting it to the free throw line. They were 10th in the league in overall offensive conference games, which, as the eighth seed is kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
And
yeah, go
go ahead.
ahead.
Oh, I just, yeah, then just for defense, actually pretty similar story. There's 36 overall for defense. So 35, 36. They're ninth in the conference game. So middle of the road, again, eighth seed. So they're not great, but good. They're good against the threes. That's number 60. Not very good defending twos, where they're 165th. They're 108th at block rate, and then they're 150th in defensive rebounding. So not very good there. They don't turn their opponents over very often. They're 140th. They don't foul much at 38th, so that's pretty good. And they do also play at a fairly decent pace at 162nd overall tempo, but on their end of the court, so the average length of offensive possession is 103rd.
Yeah, I think the total picture you get for this team is they're all right.
Yeah, I
There's
think that's
but
right.
there's nothing there is nothing really, nothing tremendously significant. I mean, free throw percentage is pretty strong, but as you said, they don't get there very much. On defense, the fact that they don't foul very often is important, so that matters. But other than that, it's a lot of very middling stuff. But what saves this team is they also don't have any area that's a disaster. They don't have the problems Michigan has, say, with turnovers and defensive rebounding.
Right.
They don't have that kind of issue. They don't have the issue Illinois has of just, horrendous 3-point shooting and the fact that they jack up a ton of them. They don't have those kind of issues. So it goes to show you can actually be a pretty competitive team, even in a deep league, if you just don't suck. at anything, and they don't. They're just kind of, middle of the pack. I would say this. I think in a league like the Big Ten, I do put more importance on the rebounding numbers. And they're very mediocre there.
Hmm.
And it's kind of hard to understand because they're not a team that lacks size. And I don't even just mean height. They've got some guys like, Kwame Evans, Supreme Cook, in addition to Biddle, those guys are put together. They're Bamba is a power wing at 6'5". I don't understand why he's not a better rebounder than he is. So I don't quite understand it, but that's one area that I will return to that theme in a little bit. But yeah, the overall profile for Oregon is don't suck.
Yeah.
And they don't suck in anything. They also don't wow you in anything. So
Yeah.
there's obviously, as we're going to talk about, there's some individual talent, but I think that especially offensively, it feels to me like this team is underachieved a little bit relative to what I think you might assume looking at these guys in a vacuum. And I think in comparison to what their reasonable expectations were. We'll talk about Jackson Shelstad, their point guard, in a minute. He was a first team all conference choice in the preseason. And he's had moments. He hasn't been bad, but he
Yeah.
hasn't played close to that level.
Yeah. I
So
feel like,
that's an area
or
where they've come up a little bit short. So I don't know, or we talked about Oregon all year. Very impressive wins in the non-conference. Very impressive.
yeah.
And then they hit the skids that five. It was a 5-game losing streak. MSU was the last of those, and everybody was kind of getting out on Oregon. They lost a bunch of games at home in the league, and then they responded with now it's 8 in a row. The one thing I would say though, because you're going to hear this on the broadcast, guaranteed tomorrow. They're talking about, well, it's the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. MSU on a 7-game win streak, Oregon on an 8-game win streak. They're not the same.
Yeah.
When you look at who Oregon's beaten, it's the lower end of the conference. Now, look, as we talked about when MSU got off to their 9-0 start, a win is a win is a win. And some of those came on the road, which it's never easy to do. I'm not trying to say Oregon didn't do anything over this string. They have. But it doesn't compare to what MSU has done on their 7-game streak. Not even
Sure.
close.
Yeah. My general impression just watching them play Indiana just a few hours ago is they still feel like a little bit like the Pac-12 team, like just kind of a little bit finesse kind of, and less hard nosed. Now I say that,
I
of
would
course,
I would
UCLA
say
is,
that's true.
yeah,
I would
UCLA
say
is
that's
not
true.
that, but I said UCLA always felt like since Cronin's been there, they seem sort of the
Yep.
exception to the rule for the Pac-12.
It's a reflection of the coaches. Look,
Yeah,
Dana Altman has been known since he was at Creighton, and I'm assuming before that, as a guy who emphasized the offensive end. That's what he's been. When I think of him, that's what I think of. When you think of Mick Cronin, you think of a brawl in an alley somewhere. I mean, that's what his teams have been. So yeah, I would agree with you. Oregon is definitely still got that kind of Pac-12 thing about them. That's not to say that they're incapable of playing with physicality at all, but it's not where their bread is buttered.
all right, so we'll move on to the Brothers Who Just Do Gutters. They only do gutters, so make sure that you have them take care of your gutter work at Michigan. It is definitely spring. I feel like I've kind of stepped into the future down here in Indianapolis. It's in the mid 70s here today, and I went golfing this morning badly, but I did go golfing. So we got in some holes, and my son just continues to get better and better, and I get no better or maybe worse. So anyway, so make sure you take care of all the spring problems like rain. So make sure to contact the Brothers Just Do Gutters to take care of that gutter work. You can find ways to contact them at our support page. The Final Four is on theschedule.com/support. And make sure you mention Final Four when you get your estimate, either to Greg or Kurt, depending what part of the state you live on, and you get 10% off. All right, so the first starter is Jackson Shelstad, 6-foot sophomore point guard. He's the guy who just kind of runs the team, averaging 13.3 points a game on 44, 38, and 34 shooting, almost a 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio. If you recall from the game in the Breslin Center, he had a huge first half. He had almost all his damage in the first half, where he had about 22 points. Then they shut him down in the second half.
Yeah, and I was talking about him a second ago. Those are fine numbers, 38% from three, mid 40s overall. He's had a capable year shooting the ball. He has not been the creator I expected. They've more or less split that playmaking role upon their three perimeter starters. And he and the other two guys, Bamba and Bartholomew, are all within, I think, 11 total assists on the year of each other. They're all in like an 80 to 91 in 30 games or 32 games grouping. So he hasn't been quite the facilitator I thought he might be. I just think, when you talked about kind of a Pac 12 aura about this team,
Hmm.
he's the guy I think about because in that game at Breslin, I really thought in the second half, Michigan State gave him a true welcoming to what the Big Ten is about because they got very physical with him. They're throwing a lot of bodies. Jaden Akins, chief among them, but a lot of guys. And it was just relentless. And I felt like they really wore him down in that game. And so I would expect Michigan State to attempt to do the same thing in this one. Again, I don't mean to say he's had a bad year because he hasn't, but I do think it's fair to suggest that their expectations and really expectations around the league were that he would be a little more impactful as a scorer and as a playmaker than he's been. He's been good. I think they expected something better than that.
Moving on then to TJ Bamba, 6'5" senior transfer from Villanova. He was in the Big Ten All Defensive team. He's averaging almost a little over 10 points a game, 2 steals a game, 3 rebounds a game, and he's shooting 37, 24, and 76, and also leads them in assists.
Yeah. Um, I, he's a decent defender. He's a good defender.
Uh,
Should not have been on that team over Trey Holloman or Jeremy Fears, in my opinion. No. But he was. You know, counting stats still matter to some people, despite the fact that we're in the year 2025 and we should be beyond that, but apparently
yeah.
not. Um, that said, Bamba's an important guy to them because, as you see, he does some of everything. Double digit scorer, barely, but he is. He can rebound a little. I think he could rebound more than he does because I mean, that's a power guard.
Yeah.
He is a power wing, 6'5". He's put together. He's a guy who doesn't look like a Pac 12 player, but he doesn't rebound quite as well as you think he might. Uh, Playmaker, obviously a defender. So he does a little bit of everything for them. So he's an important guy in that sense. The thing you can't get around with him is, and this goes back to a couple of years ago, he started his career at Washington State and was really good there. And then he transferred to Villanova. And he was one of the main portal names that year. And people thought he was really going to explode. And he actually stepped back. He did not have a good year last year at Villanova. So he decided to move on, went to Oregon. And I think he's recovered a little bit from that. But what he hasn't done is ever capitalize on his offensive potential. You mentioned the 3-point shooting, 24%. That's been an issue the last couple of years. He just has not shot well from the perimeter.
Yeah.
Now, the plus side is he's the most aggressive guard they've got on a team that really doesn't get to the line a ton. He averages 4 free throw attempts a game. So it shows you that he recognizes to some extent his issues as a jump shooter and tries to get things going at the rim, but only to a certain degree. So again, he's been a good, solid overall player. Maybe not the star people thought he might become a couple years ago.
Then we have Keyshawn Bartholomew, 6'1" senior, averaging 10.2 points a game on 43, 43, and 88 shooting. Third in the team in assists. He had 5 points in the Michigan State game earlier this year.
Yeah, he's a nice. It's funny. It goes to show you what role and even including myself in this, what role expectations have in
Right.
evaluating what a player is giving you, because the stat line is not. Bartholomew is more efficient, than the other two guys, but it's not like a dramatic difference between he and Bomba or he and Shellstead. His assist numbers are third on the team, but a very close third. But he's averaging less than one turnover a game. So he's been more efficient than the other two guys that way. And his shooting numbers have been pretty efficient. I mean, plus
Yeah.
40% overall from three, and he makes his free throws. So he's had a nice season, but it feels even night, whereas I'm talking about these other two guys maybe not being quite what people thought they would be. Bartholomew, my feeling is, oh yeah, he's a really nice, support guy to have, but the numbers aren't that much more impressive than the other two.
Right.
So
Yeah.
just that's I'm just trying to illustrate the point that sometimes the biases we're coming into this stuff with seem to impact our conclusions when maybe they shouldn't. But in fairness, he has been a more efficient player than the other two guys.
Next, we have Brandon Angel, 6'9", senior transfer from Stanford, averaging 8.4 points a game, 4 rebounds a game, shooting 53, 34, and 82. And he scored 6 in the matchup into the Breslin.
Yeah, again, solid. I keep saying the same thing about these guys. Solid player, but just not
Describes the team.
quite the impact. I think they thought he might be a little better as a stretch four. He hasn't been terrible. He's just not been great. I think they thought maybe he could be a 40% plus guy, and he hasn't been that. I think they probably thought he could have given him a little bit more as a rebounder, and he hasn't. What he's not is, and I don't know how much of this you got from today's game, he's very much not a physical presence at the
No,
four.
I agree.
He's a finesse guy. That's another guy, and it stands to reason because he started out at Stanford, right? He strikes you as a Pac 12 kind of guy.
Yeah. And then finally, we have Nate Biddle in the middle, 7-foot senior, first team all defense member, averaging 14.1 points a game, 7.3 rebounds a game, both of which would lead the team. He also has about 2.3 blocks a game, shooting 51, 34, and 82, so he can stretch the floor. He was very limited in the matchup in East Lansing, where he only scored 8, but because of problems with fouls, pretty much.
Yeah, and he will occasionally do that. I've observed that if Biddle's got a weakness that would trouble you, that might be where you'd start, is just takes, and it goes along with being a shot blocker to some extent, maybe take some risks from time to time that you would rather not see him take if you're his head coach. He's a good player, and it's fantastic for him that he's finally been able to stay healthy. First time in his career, he's played in excess of 30 games. Last year, he only played 5 before the
Oh,
season
okay.
ended with
Yeah.
injuries. So good for him that he's been able to stay healthy. And he's very, very important to them because they already struggle defending twos, and they don't have much in the way of rim protection other than him. So he's the guy who gives them somebody that, they were mentioning at halftime on the television broadcast of the IU Oregon game. And I agreed with the observation that even though Biddle wasn't getting a ton of blocks, his presence was definitely altering the way Indiana was choosing to try to score.
Yeah. They would hit
They
the
weren't,
brakes oftentimes in the lane and turn
yeah,
around.
exactly. They weren't
Yeah.
challenging them the way you'd like to see. Now, I don't think Michigan State will do that. I think they'll go at them, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But good player. He's another one. It was on that all defense team, and for a very mediocre defensive team to get two guys on the other was weird. And again, it shows you the bias of counting stats. It's the block shots. And I don't mean that Biddle's a bad defensive player, but a lot of people wondered why Julian Reese from Maryland didn't get that spot, and I could agree with that. God's honest truth, the best defensive big man in the league, and I'm saying this with trying to muster as much objectivity as I can. The best defensive big in this league, in my opinion, is Carson Cooper. And I don't think it's particularly close. But you'll never, I mean, trust me, there wasn't a millisecond's worth of time spent thinking about Carson Cooper as an all defensive team
Right.
choice.
Well, he doesn't even
But it's the
start.
truth.
And so that, and,
Right. But
and
it's the
those,
truth.
yeah, sure. And the writers, you got to, I mean, it's not excuse, explanation, whatever you want to call it, but they're watching just one team. They occasionally watch the other teams when they come and play them, but they're not, watching Big Ten basketball every night, most likely. And so that you're going to watch the stats just like it is in
Right.
football. It's even more,
Yep.
more present
But
in
again,
football because
I
you
don't
only
mean
watch one
that.
game. Yeah.
And I don't mean that to suggest that Biddle's not an important offensive
Right. Oh,
player,
yeah, yeah.
and
I
he's a
see.
good player. He is. It's just that was another both of the guys from Oregon that made that team. I'm like, well, they're all right, but I could rattle off a few guys that I would have put there instead of them.
Right. All right. So quickly go through the reserves. We start with JD and Tracy, 6'5" senior, averaging 7.2 points a game, 2.8 rebounds a game in about 22 minutes. He shoots 49, 35, and 69, and he had 5 points in the first matchup.
Basically, a sixth starter for them. He can
Sure.
play the wing, gives them a little bit of scoring punch. Again, okay shooter, not a great one. Can get them some stuff athletically from time to time. Nice piece to have as a sixth man.
Then we have Kwame Evans, 6'9" sophomore, averaging 6.3 points a game, 4.2 rebounds a game, plays about 16 minutes. He shoots 48, 29, and 73, and he had 10 points in the first matchup.
A former McDonald's All-American, a guy with a world of talent, and you see the potential when you see him play. He's one of their guys that at least doesn't look like a Pac-12 player. At times he plays like one, but he's capable in any given game of really making an impact. The trouble is if you're Dana Altman, you don't know which Kwame Evans is going to show up, and that's the reason why he's not a starter. That's the reason why his production is somewhat muted, is that inconsistency.
Then we have one of the best named players in the league, Supreme Cook, which is, I think, even better than Great Ozabor. 6'9" senior, big man, averaging 5 points a game, 2.7 rebounds a game, plays only about 12 minutes, shoots 54% from the floor, almost a matching 54% from the line. He had 8 points in the other matchup.
Yeah, his playing time has shrunk a little bit as we've
Quite a
gotten
bit, yeah.
closer to the end of the season. He didn't play much today, right? And
Hmm.
the interesting thing is, IU, as we know, brings a lot of size. Now, I didn't notice them playing Renault and Ballo together a ton today.
Yeah.
It didn't
I feel
seem
like the
like it
first
was as,
half more, but yeah, whatever.
yeah. But I guess my point is you would have expected this matchup to be one that Cook might have played a little
Right.
more because he's legitimate, again, like Evans, but maybe even more so. He's a guy who does play with Big Ten style physicality at times. I remember him playing pretty well against Michigan State in the first game, but I don't know how much we're going to see him. I would think we'll see him a little bit more than you saw him today, just because of what Michigan State presents from a depth perspective. But um, Oregon's doing the thing that broadcasters always like to talk about, which is, well, when it gets to March, you got to shrink the rotation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Dana Altman does kind of look to me like he's doing that. We'll see how that goes for him.
And then finally, Raheem Moss, 6'3" senior, transfer from Toledo, averages a little under 2 points a game, a little under 2 rebounds a game, shooting 31, 13, and 70.
Yeah, been a tough year for him. Those Toledo transfers, man, it's they always seem to have a point guard, and they might have another one too this year. They had a guy who went to U of D High here in Detroit that had a very good year, Sonny Wilson. It wouldn't surprise me if he transfers up, but they've had several of these guys over the last few years in the transfer era who have jumped up to a higher level. If you remember Jerron Simmons, who played at Michigan, was a MAC player of the year and then a total bust at Michigan. But they had a kid, Ray J. Dennis, who went to Baylor last year, I believe, and had a very
Right.
good year.
Hmm.
This guy, another one, didn't do much. So you just never know with those Toledo point guards. You don't
Yeah.
know whether to trust that Maction or not.
You don't know whether the rocket's going to crash or take off, huh? Is that
Right,
the?
exactly. He played 1 minute today, so we might see him. Again, Michigan State's
Yeah.
depth will test them maybe a little differently than IU did, but I don't think we'll see a lot of him.
So of those players, who is the player? Now I think the first time is Biddle as a player for Michigan State to keep in the gutter, and Shellstad's the one kind of went crazy in the first half. Who do you have for this game? Do you think?
I'm gonna go with Shellstead in this one,
Yeah.
just because
Hmm.
having watched that game, I think and their season, honestly, I think it really does tell the story for them. If you can get into Shellstead and limit him, and despite the inconsistency in his scoring, and by the way, his game against Michigan State was one of the better scoring games he's had this year,
Right.
as evidenced by the fact that it was 9 points more than he averages. But he's a dangerous player because he's got a good enough handle and he's athletic enough. He can create his own shot, and he's a streaky guy. He's a guy who can get on a run. He's one of those players that could, you look at and you could see, yeah, he could bust you for 9 points in a minute. He could hit three triples on you in 60 seconds of clock time. So he's the head of the snake.
Yeah.
And I think in this game, I'm going to lean toward him being the guy Michigan State's got to contain.
All right. So who cleans the glass best? Brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. Friends, it is spring. As I mentioned, obviously make sure your gutters are taken care of, but also make sure your windows are clean so you can see out of them and see the beautiful birds and the sunshine outside. Make sure it gets in the house nicely. So head on over to the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You can find ways to contact Troy and his team, even if you're not in Grand Rapids specifically or in just the greater Grand Rapids area. You can get a hold of them and they can give you 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find that at our support page at tffinots.com/support. And so I get to pick first this time. Currently, you are up 16-10 for our contest this year. Hopefully, we've got 9 games left for the season. We at least have 2 for sure. And I'm going to go with Kohler to start out.
Okay. Carson Cooper, the obvious second choice.
Obvious. Cooper, yep.
And then I'm gonna go Jase Richardson.
Okay, so Cooper and Richardson. And then for my second one, I'm going to go with I'm going to just go with Akins. I think this time we'll see how things turn out.
It's interesting. We both gone off Cohen Carr.
We have. I just
but not without reason.
Yeah, we'll see. It's that third and fourth pick are always kind of crapshoot. So
yeah.
All right, so moving on then to the 5 keys of the game brought to you by Nudge Printing. Nudge Printing just came out. If you want to head over to nudgeprinting.com, you can find out their new selection. They have all kinds of selections now for the city of Detroit, all kinds of cool Detroit stuff. So check that stuff out. Also, you can obviously all your great Spartan apparel. You can get 20% off. You type in Final Four just as one word in checkout when you go to get your order in. Again, can't go wrong with Nudge Printing. I got all kinds of Nudge Printing stuff with me right now. Although I'm not wearing it today because I've got the black and gold, and I know that's going to make Rod get a reaction. All right, so 5 keys of the game. First key of the game is fresh versus warmed up. This is always the classic thing: is it better to have played a game or two before? And the team that's waiting with all those buys, are they at a disadvantage? Today, the first game with a team that had a 1-game advantage, Northwestern, got taken care of pretty easily by Wisconsin. Of course, that we're not talking about the same quality teams, I suppose.
I think there's probably a bigger gap in that game than there is in this one.
Yeah.
Oregon, obviously, a decidedly better team than, especially the current version of Northwestern, which, frankly, Chris Collins should have probably gotten some Coach of the Year votes just for getting them to this tournament. What they had left. I mean, I'm not kidding. I think that depth absolutely can matter in multi-day events like this, where there's not even that day in between the way there is in the NCAA tournament, but they don't matter yet. Like, tonight I was playing their third game, right?
Tonight will be their second game.
Their second game. I'm sorry. It started yesterday. Yeah. So nobody's in that position yet. Tomorrow they might be if Iowa or USC get through.
Right.
But I think that's the point. When it's your 3rd and 3, that's the point that you start wondering, okay, is depth going to be a factor? Or are these teams going to be exhausted? So that does make, and I don't think there's any definitive evidence on this front, but I can understand the rationale that having played a game, if only because you're now used to the environment. Obviously, Indianapolis, a little bit of a different environment than the home gyms that these schools play in. From a shooting perspective, it's a little bit different. So the background. So I can see that argument, but I think that only carries you so far. I think in general, we use hindsight to decide which of these things mattered most. But we'll see how the game goes tomorrow. If Michigan State comes out and they just look rusty, which really they shouldn't. I mean,
it's only been 6 days or 5 days, right?
They played on Sunday.
It's not forever since they played.
It's not that unusual, but nevertheless, we'll see if Oregon comes out and looks a little sharper we might read into that, maybe more than we should. But
It's funny because during the season, if we say, "Oh, we only have 5 days rest," and they've got three, that's a huge advantage.
advantage.
But now it's like one day.
Yep.
It's an advantage to play the
100%.
day
That's why I
before. Like it
say
doesn't make. Yeah,
it's a talking point. It's something people will talk about, and depending upon who wins, they'll retrofit the argument.
exactly. All right. So the second key to the game is the boards. We mentioned Oregon, average team on the boards. Michigan State is obviously elite at both ends. And so, can you get out an edge here?
Well, this is what I would say. Today, Oregon got beat up on the offensive boards by an Indiana team that definitely has size, but over the course of the season has not been great rebounding the ball. In the first meeting between Michigan State and Oregon, in terms of rebounding percentage, which is all we really care about, MSU, I believe, at a 12% advantage. Raw rebounds, it was 11-10 Oregon, but Michigan State shot vastly better than Oregon. So they won the percentage battle pretty handedly. This is an area Michigan State needs to have an advantage. I don't think there's any question about that. You should. You're a better rebounding team consistently than this Oregon group is, so you should have an advantage there.
Right. All right. So the third key to the game is attack. And this is something we've seen Michigan State sometimes have trouble with. Generally, really good attacking and making sure they not only, this is not necessarily just fast break, but this is more like attacking on the offensive end, just in the half court.
Absolutely. So that means, offensive rebounding, right? Going after the
Yep.
ball, getting second chances, putbacks. It means going off the dribble, getting to the rim, getting into the lane. And I think it was important. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, Oregon, as we've said, not a good defensive team against twos. They're not great against threes either, but they're not terrible against threes. They're better against threes than they are against twos. And so you see that as a potential chink in the armor. But then beyond that, you also look at that first game. They got Biddle in foul trouble. Well, that's kind of a big deal. You take him away from Oregon, that's their leading scorer and rebounder and shot blocker.
Yeah.
So he does a lot for them. If you take him out of the game for long stretches, big advantage MSU. And one way to maybe get him out of the game is to be relentless in attacking because, as we noted earlier, he will take some chances.
Yeah. And so the fourth key to the game is zone. And I think you made a good point. I don't know if it was last game or maybe another previous game. Just talking about the fact that Indiana played a zone, but they don't normally play zone, and you almost have to just commit to zone versus just kind of occasionally just throwing it out there. Like if it's like if you're not a team that runs the ball, suddenly you're just going to try and pound the ball in a game. It's probably not a
If
good idea if that's not who you are.
if you're going to be any good at it,
Yeah.
I believe that you have to commit to it, but that doesn't stop coaches from trying it on occasion. I would be surprised to see a steady diet of zone from Oregon because it's not. I don't know. Do you recall? Did they show much zone at all today?
I don't remember seeing hardly any zone
Yeah,
outside of when Iowa played a little
it's
bit against Ohio
entirely.
State.
I'm mentioning this here just because it sticks in my mind as something I could see Dana Altman trying. Again, not in a sustained way necessarily, but just occasionally, the way we've seen some other coaches, the way we've seen uh, Dusty May, or I was going to say something else, but
Yeah. Good for you.
Fran
Big of you.
McCaffrey. Yeah, this week's been an eye opener. Uh, or Fran McCaffrey. These guys that will bust out a half-ass zone look for a few possessions. To try to screw with your momentum. But I could, even though Oregon doesn't do it much, I could kind of see it. It also makes some sense in terms of perhaps providing a path to keeping their big out of foul trouble.
Right.
Maybe. The flip side of it is it would make a bad defensive rebounding situation even worse. So I don't know that I'd expect a ton of it, but if they do spring it as a surprise, which this is the time of year, if guys are inclined to do that kind of thing, I don't think it's smart, but some guys do it. Uh, this would be a situation where maybe I could imagine it happening, as opposed to, let's say Michigan State gets past this one and they end up in a semifinal against either Wisconsin or UCLA. I'd be very surprised to see either of those coaches
Right.
trot out a zone.
Yeah, I feel like the only time you're going to see zone really is probably against Michigan or Iowa in the finals, which is both I
Yeah,
think are
or
unlikely
yeah.
matchups. The
So
remaining
if
team
they do
or
spring
USC, I
it,
guess.
if they do spring it at Michigan State, it's important that Michigan State do the things we always talk about: get into the gaps, either via the dribble or the pass, force that thing to collapse, get good looks, and that doesn't just mean threes. It means getting good looks at the rim too, because you can do that. And so that's what you'd want to see if they spring that kind of thing as a surprise. I don't know that they will.
All right, so the fifth and final key to the game is depth. Oregon plays 7 players. They occasionally go a little bit deeper, but for the most part, it's a pretty tight rotation. Michigan State obviously plays 10 and 9 at least, all with over like 15 minutes usually.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where we really started talking about this. Well, I guess it was after the Indiana game, which was one after the last meeting with Oregon. But this effect that Michigan State has had really in 6 of the 7 games, the only time it didn't happen was this last one against Michigan, where the second half, Michigan State just owned the game consistently against everybody they played. And it did seem like that was in large part a function of their depth, of the fact that Michigan State was constantly rolling out fresh bodies and opponents weren't able to match that. And the dilemma you're faced with, and Dana Altman's team is a really good example of that. Could he try to go deeper into his bench to try to match MSU? Yeah, he could. He could play Raheem Moss more minutes. But then the problem becomes what is happening to the quality of player you're putting out there for those additional minutes.
Right.
So Michigan State's kind of got you either way. Either they're getting your better players at a lower energy level, or they're getting worse players to match up with. And that's how I see it. I think that it's not that, oh, Oregon played a game today and they play again tomorrow, so they're going to be worn down. It's not that. It's the more the normal effect of 40 minutes of playing Michigan State, as we've seen again and again. Are they in a position where, say, the last 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, the last portion of the game, their energy level is just much higher than the opponent?
All right. And so I think we'll pretty much close up there. Just a couple quick notes here. I thought it was very funny before the Iowa Ohio State game. They, like their MC guy when he's announcing the two teams, he called them the Ohio State Buccaneers. I thought that was pretty good.
That is good.
uh, there weren't enough Buckeye fans in the stands to really care, so it was not really that big a deal.
That's a shame.
Yeah, I know exactly. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow's game with Michigan playing whoever they're going to play, just to see where what their free throw defense is, and so we'll see where they have their players positioned on the court. So
it has been a week. I wish we had more
fun.
time to talk about
I do too.
Dusty May's podcast tour.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the joke was that maybe we should try and get him on. And I don't know, at this point, it seems like I just love for you to just kind of run like a court trial. Like I noticed in the 10 other free throws.
that would I would rank that just a tiny, tiny, tiny notch behind getting Izzo as a dream guest for this podcast for vastly different reasons.
Oh, and also the other thing is I almost ran into Brad Underwood on the sidewalk this morning, heading to the first session at games. I didn't even realize it, and my son's like, "Dad, you see that was Brad? That was Brad Underwood there." I just saw a guy walking by in an Illinois get up, and I said, "Oh man, I missed an opportunity to get a picture with him or something like that. Would be pretty cool."
Did he accuse you of fouling him?
No, I didn't know. He did not. He was like
he didn't threaten to send a tape to the Big Ten office.
No, my friend was joking that he's probably talking to his agent about the Texas job. So we'll see.
Ah,
what happens.
That's an interesting thought.
So we'll see if the Hawkeyes can take out Illinois tonight. If Illinois goes 3 for 48 from 3, so we'll hope that's the case. So. Until next time, and we'll be live again right after the session. So it's not going to be right after the Michigan State game. It'll be after whatever the second game is. So I'll see everyone there. And so until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.
Okay, so yeah, so it's probably going to be roughly the same time tomorrow then. Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so.
Well, Wisconsin UCLA is slated for 2:30. It's exactly the same schedule.
Yeah.
So
The only difference to be is if the game is as bad as the
you
Northwestern
might
game
not be
was.
able to leave early. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. I got to try and find. I got to turn off this live stream here at some point. Let's see here. One of these days I'll get. They just don't make it so it's fast. Unfortunately, there we go. Oh my gosh, YouTube. Okay, so I will talk to you later then.
Are we still